Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to Budget Worship. This week, we are going to introduce our inaugural non-welcome episode. For those who are wondering, I'm Matt. I am the new silent partner to the Budget Worship umbrella and experience. You know Rob from last week, and you know him from Budget Worship Leaders. Without getting too much into the detail, I came on this project because I had a similar passion to Rob. I actually started something up as an audio podcast a while back for Tech on a Budget, and when I saw what he was doing, I kind of got with him and figured out, hey, these paths may need to kind of merge if we're both on board with it. So long story short, that's where I came into this picture, and I'm going to be kind of the silent partner on the back end more than not, but I may come out in front of the camera occasionally just to share some of my experiences as a committee leader for a church, as an audiovisual technician of many years, a videographer, a photographer. So I may come in and go in and out with that. That being said, this week we're going to kind of kick off the new Budget Worship experience, specifically talking about where we are and how we got here. The idea behind all this is the passion that we both had for this is, how do you experience worship on a budget? So the question that got brought up is, why are you doing worship on a budget? So there's two main reasons we wanted to talk about. And for anyone interested, we also have a blog. We're going to be using the blog as kind of the typed up point that some people just prefer. So feel free to check us out on the blog, and we'll go into more detail on that. But on that, if you read it, you'll see that the main point that we're going to focus on is stewardship. A lot of people know what stewardship is at a high level, but we wanted to dig in a little bit and figure out, why does that matter when it comes to worship? Well, the primary reason I'm going to hit on, and I'm going to let Rob speak to how at his church as well, he plays with us at our church as well, but how and why is stewardship important? There's so many Bible verses that I don't want to pick any one that talk about stewardship, but the general idea is God puts us in a position of leadership in our churches, some of us, not all of us necessarily, to lead and guide worship, the teaching of God's word, the ministries, the missions, things like that. Well, in our case, it's mostly about the worship aspect of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to delve into that. As a committee leader, I have been put in a position of leadership to try to guide our technology, our budget for our worship, our budget for our audiovisual, which are all interconnected. Anyone who's done any audiovisual lately knows that everything uses networking, computers, you get TVs, video screens, it's all connected. And then you got the musicianship of it, where you have in-ear monitors, iPads with your music and things like that. So without really delving in too deeply at this point, the one thing I wanted to hit on for this episode is the practical aspect of this is, how do we budget churches as a whole? How do we budget and why? So I'll speak to how we do it after, but I wanted Rob, talk to me for a minute about your church, where you come from. Give us an idea on the size of the church.
I come from it's a very small church in a decent sized building. It's out in the middle of the sticks, and we have attendance of about 180 people a week. We have one service. It's a blended service between, it was originally, a choir for 50 some odd years. The church just had a choir and no praise and worship team. And then I came in, long story short, we had a pretty brutal split. And when the church split, we had a gutted choir. So I had been trying for a couple of years to put together a praise and worship team. When the church split and the choir got gutted, that really kind of gave me the opportunity to get with a bunch of the leadership of the church and say, hey, look, this is what we need. We need to be able to backfill the choir. We need to take some of the load off of them, because if there's only 6 choir members, they sing, and we didn't want to do away with the choir, because that is a ministry, and we didn't want to make anybody feel like they weren't needed or weren't wanted, and that's definitely not the case. We want to be in a situation where everybody gets to participate in worship, and everybody gets to be the ones that are helping guide the congregation into worship, which is why we do what we do. So really what it became just a way for us to bring the music to the congregation, the worship to the congregation in such a way that no one team had the bulk of everything put on them, and that required a lot of new equipment that we weren't exactly ready for. I mean, this church had been running I think a 24 channel analog mixing console running into a data converter. I think we're still using S-video cameras, so I mean we still have a long ways to go as far as upgrading the equipment. We're trying to do so on a budget because despite the fact that my church, has very, very my church has people that are willing to give to make sure that we get everything that we need. I don't also want to be too much of a burden on that. So I want to make sure that I'm being a good steward of what the Lord is providing for us. It means, yes, we're upgrading our equipment, but I don't want to necessarily go out and buy a $5,000 keyboard when a $1,000 keyboard will do just the same thing and do it just fine. It's little things like that. And, our ministry has always been, don't upgrade anything until it has to be upgraded. So like we just recently, I think 6 months ago, you and I were talking about, we just recently upgraded to a digital mixing console, and we're still cutting our teeth on that and having some issues with that. So when we get that figured out, we'll see where we have to upgrade next. But we don't really want to upgrade until it's going to be truly beneficial beyond just having new toys to play with.
Well, that actually brings up an interesting point. You said talking about upgrading when you have to versus when you want to, which brings an interesting balancing act that all churches have to deal with. When is the right time to upgrade your equipment to new technology specifically, but also just to avoid being so far behind that you can't do anything useful anymore with it beyond just run it every week. So our church experienced that as well. We went to digital a while back. We've been on it for a good while, and we standardized across around our campus to the same technology, primarily so multiple sound technicians could be trained on the same system and not have hit or miss things. But the point I guess I'm getting around to in a not so subtle way is right now we could very easily, if we wanted, upgrade to the next level, which would still be considered budget friendly but not excessive. But we've actually been approached a couple of times, hey, why don't we upgrade to get more channels in our in-ears? Well, 2 reasons. Here's just an example. Number one, we still struggle with the in-ears that we have at times with the concepts and how to work them and things like that. That's minimal. The main thing is when you upgrade the in-ears per se, you now have to bring in a new digital snake or a new technology, possibly Dante versus AES. You bring in a new board. So what should be a simple upgrade turns into a multiple thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. So you beg the question, do I do it now or do I piecemeal it a little at a time and do it? So we're not going to get into that so much, but that was a good point you made is you just now get on a digital board. You got to cut your teeth on it. You got to learn how it helps you. It's very easy to get distracted and say, oh, there's a new one out. Somebody just donated a couple $1,000s. Let's go ahead and upgrade. Well, that couple of $1,000 could upgrade it, but it could also end up going toward missions, or it could pay for a local missions opportunity, like feed the people around you and do a cleanup day. So that's the dance we always do is when to do things versus does it make sense to spend that money at all. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to go from y'all. Y'all, you said y'all average about how many?
About 180 on a Sunday.
Okay, we have 2 services at our church, and each one is probably at about that level. So fundamentally, we're the same. We have 2 different segmented churches that come together frequently. We have a contemporary and a traditional. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what Rob just spoke about and kind of showcase how that works in our church as well from a budgeting perspective. So now, because we're a multi-building campus, and with multiple services, everything we look at from a budget perspective has to be in that model. So if we're going to broadcast a live stream, it's not just a live stream, it's multiple live streams, it's multiple computers, it's multiple cameras. So that's a good example of where you have to say, do we really want to spend, what should be a few $100s is now a couple of $1,000s because of the multiple use cases. So I would like to transition away for a second, though, and talk more about the practical side of the budgeting itself. Do y'all have committees at your church?
We don't really have a committee. What we have is we have the men of the church all come together once a quarter, and we have our men's meeting. That's where all the decisions get made. Everything gets voted on, and everyone from every male 18 or older from the pastor down has a vote, and it's expected that that vote is also each man that votes is also talking to his family, talking to his wife and his kids, and making sure that what they're voting on is actually best for the whole family, not just for what they want. And it's a weird way of doing it, and it's a very hard way to get things done, because having the agreement across the board, there's just so many people that come together and have different ideas that, just getting the parking lot paved took 2 years.
Why is that? Why is it because there wasn't a unanimous consent to do it, or was it because there was a lot of him-hauling?
It's very hard to make a decision with that many people, because, well, there's what about this scenario? What about that scenario? So you have to go through all the scenarios in order to make a decision, and you have to make sure that every different scenario has been accounted for. Like when we went to the digital board, it was who's going to run it, who are we going to train to run it, and luckily I have some very, very smart people with electronics and other friends that I can call, you being one of them, when I have an issue. Hey, I need you to show me how to set up reverb on this channel. That was just a few weeks ago, wasn't it? Yeah. We had that conversation. And luckily, my church has a lot of very, very devoted people to this, and a lot of people who care a lot about the small details that the way my brain works, I don't pay attention to those small little details, like, well, what happens if we just recently had a new building added? Because we had a fire and the youth building burned down. So what we had to do was we turned our old sanctuary into a youth building. Well, the insurance money from the church paid for that. So now the youth have a brand new room. Well, we have this empty spot in the middle of the church. Well, what are we going to do with that? And there was different ideas coming up for what we should do with that. We ended up making a couple of classrooms out of it for for small groups and Bible studies, and the logistics of how the roof was going to be put on there and how it was going to tie in with the existing roof lines, and just things like that me as an artist and as a worship leader am completely not interested in. Things that I don't
turned into a discussion.
Turned into a multi-week discussion.
Yeah, and that's a point for another episode. We won't get into it here, but that's something that kind of goes along with the budgeting, is like being in a Baptist church, and I've been in others as well. The whole committee team, let's not get into the semantics and not get in the weeds, but the reality is when you've got a lot of different people, you got a lot of different opinions, you got a lot of different mindsets, and you have to deal with that. Some of the stuff you're talking about is implementation. So I like to kind of push that off to the side, which is we need to make a decision on if we're going to do it, not how we're going to do
right.
it. That we're not going to get into that on the churches, because that's not what we're here for. What we want to talk about is the actual practical side of how do I budget better on our spending so that we are A, being good stewards of God's money, B, are being smart with our decisions. This is a huge deal that I tried to bring when I took over some of the leadership position, is how do I be smart with the decisions of what we implement and what we buy so that we're not replacing gear every 2 years because we picked the wrong technology or the wrong gear, that kind of thing. So I'll give you a perfect example, projectors. That's one where churches struggle a lot, because projectors can literally be as junky as you want, or they can be as good as you want, and the price reflects that drastically. So when we were looking at it, we had a couple of issues with lighting that came down that was diffusing the light, to say, in some degree. And so we had to look at higher lumen projectors. Well, everything we were being told was that's too high of a lumen count. But in practicality, we actually had to spend a little more and get higher lumens and get a laser projector to be able to cut through lights, and it worked for our church. The point I'm making is this. We could have very easily spent $10,000 on a projector setup. We could have very easily spent $600. But somewhere in the middle is where we had to meet and say, this is the right decision for our church to not overspend but not underspend. So from a practical standpoint, that's what we're trying to talk about. For your church, a good example, we don't provide instruments for anybody beyond drums and keyboard typically, because guitarists tend to be very picky about what they play. But some churches provide basses, guitars, things like that for youth that are coming up to learn, or for people to play, so that they don't have to bring their own every week. these are the budget discussions. Okay, well, do we want to go buy an American Standard Classic, Les Paul for $1,800?
That's always the answer, by the way.
Yeah,
Les Paul is always the answer.
Yeah, I'm a Les Paul fan as well, except when you're talking about my back pain, and then we won't get into that. But the point I make is this, and I'll even spin the camera around just as an example. This is one of the locations at our church that we work off of, and you can see it's your typical layout for a smaller setup. This is our youth. You can see a keyboard, drums, we bring in guitars, we bring in a bass, we have a small sound system that's actually a high end, but it's very small. So just as an example, without getting too much into the weeds on it, you have to make a decision. Do I want the Nord? You've all heard it, where the Nord is, the Lord is. Yeah, that ain't how I feel. But back to what you were talking about at your church, what I was going to say is what we do here is we do what's called a wish list budget, which is every year we basically, and I say we, I do a lot of it, but I try to bring in all of our techs, all of our volunteers, people like that. And the goal is, hey, what can we do better? What tools do we need to do better? We don't want to go spend $20,000 because A, we don't have it, and B, even if we did, I don't want to spend that kind of money unless it's absolutely critical. So we do a wish list and we say, okay, what cables do we need to replace? Is there a better way to hook things up? Is there a need for a better keyboard here? Are we having actual problems that we want to fix? So Rob, from your church's perspective, how do y'all treat that same process?
A perfect example of that would be because of the way my church is set up, we have our worship platform, and then next to it we have the pit. That's where the piano, the drums, and the bass player are. And that's just out of necessity from the fact that it was just a choir for so long. But there was a serious problem getting the mics drummed because we didn't have a drum enclosure. We didn't have a really good microphone setup, and we didn't have enough channels on the board to properly mic a drum set. So I had gotten an electronic drum set, just a little, $400 electronic drum set, Alesis Nitro, and I had used this at home to practice with. And I finally, the thought had occurred to me, this would really cut down on the noise in the pit. So what I did was I went to the men's meeting. I got with the church's drummer because at that point, that was before the split, we had a full-time drummer and I was just the backup at that point. And I asked him, I said, how would you like to have an electronic drum set? I said, I'll bring mine in, we'll play with it, see what you think of it. Well, he didn't like mine because it had 8-inch pads and those aren't much fun for a drummer to play on. So I found this Roland drum set. It was a TD-17. It had a 14-inch snare drum. And that's pretty much, the pads were almost the size of what you would expect from a regular drum set, an acoustic drum set. And as soon as he played it, he realized that he could talk to the piano player and the bass player without having to have a plexiglass shield in front of him that stopped the cymbal bleed. And we stopped having to pull the drums out of the mics, or we stopped not being able to pull the drums out of the microphones. And with the live stream, you could never hear the drums. Well, once we got the electronic drums, that runs straight into the soundboard. So that fixed all of those problems. And all it took was me going to the drummer saying, hey, what do you think about this? We came to an understanding of what he was looking for within the price range. I think we paid like $1,700 for it. And then I went to the men's meeting and I just said, hey guys, we've got this issue with this drum set. Here's a solution. This is what it's going to cost us. Is this a viable option? I think that this is probably the best equipment that we really need without going, into the $8,000 electronic drum sets that look like real drums, which I'd love to have, don't get me wrong, but we really didn't need it. What we needed was something that we could capture the sound with better, something that would quiet down the stage noise, and that's exactly what we got. So I just went to the men of the church at the men's meeting and said, here's the solution to the problem that we've got, and I'd like to just take a vote on it. And everybody voted, yeah, let's go get it. So I went down to the local music store, told them what I needed. It came in a couple of weeks later, got it installed, and we've been using it ever since.
So that brings up a perfect example of what we're trying to do here at Budget Worship. A real problem, a real solution, both researched, implemented, purchased and implemented, end to end, without breaking the bank. But the point of all that is finding a real problem and solving it with a budget solution. Too many churches, and I speak from experience because I've been called in on consulting gigs so many times, too many churches feel like there's a problem that's not really a problem, or it's not really a top tier problem, and their immediate response is, what do we need to replace? What do we need a better sound system? It's like, your sound system's fine. You have a specific problem. How do you fix it? And here's a dollar amount that you can stay within. That's not necessarily a bad thing that churches are willing to spend the money, but my point that I've always made is, let's just use a round number, $25,000, okay? We can replace a massive sound system and projection system for $25,000, and that's going to be a top tier solution. How much of that money can go toward missions and toward reaching people and preaching the word when you really only need $4,000? And that's what we're here to do. We're here to help the small and mid-sized churches make these decisions. Let's be realistic in all of this. A big church with a big congregation is going to have what we call subject matter experts. I'm a subject matter expert. Rob is a subject matter expert on the things he does. When we meet our minds together, we can solve a lot of problems in a very budget-conscious way. Not every church has subject matter experts on certain things, and that is where tools like what we're doing with Budget Worship are going to come in. We want people to be able to reach out to us and watch these videos and read our blog and get recommendations, or maybe even reach out and we can come out if it's local enough and give some recommendations. I was just at a church the other day, and they were having problems with buzz in their lines that had recently appeared. And when I get there, they're using an old telephone block wiring system for their speaker lines. And I'm like, that's not what it was designed for. So how do I fix that? Well, you've got a snake in your floor. Why aren't you using the snake? Well, we've never had to. Well, you've got a snake in your floor. Why aren't you using the snake? So we fixed that problem very inexpensively and very quickly, but without a subject matter expert that can come in and spend a few minutes and help them solve this, too many churches, I feel like, are struggling. And if you ever have heard of a primitive church, primitive Baptist church, you understand you don't need all of this to worship and to preach the Word of God. But it sure helps when you've got 200 plus people in a room if you just have a speaker or a microphone. So even the most primitive setups need a budget-conscious solution to be able to reach people. But anyway, for this point, I think we've kind of hit the point home on this, which is find real problems in your church or in your nonprofit or your organization that you have by asking questions, like Rob said, talking to your drummer, talking to your guitar players, talk to your instrumentalist, your praise leader. What are the problems? What can you not hear? What do you need to hear? What do you need to see? You got confidence monitors that you can do now on walls or in front of you. These are relatively inexpensive to add now with things like Apple TVs, and TVs themselves are disposable now for the price. So ask the right questions. Go find solutions that fit, and don't limit yourself to looking at the first solution that gets popped up on I'm not going to say any website names because we're going to keep the sponsorship to a minimum. But you know the websites we're talking about. When you go up there, they're going to put the big ticket names in front of you. Don't bite on them. Go talk to your local music store. Shop local. That's one of my biggest pet peeves in this world is everybody just jumps to the big dogs, the Amazons and things like that. Go talk to your local store. They might have a brand that's still a good name brand, but it's a third of the cost, and it'll get you by fine, and you're helping keep a business in business. The last thing real quick before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you also from the budgeting perspective, let's say you went to your group, which obviously y'all's process is different than ours. Ours we have to do a yearly, and we say these are the things we need, and we have a finance committee, and they come back to us and say, we're fine with all that, but we're having to cut costs. The economy's tight. Can you cut back on X, Y, and Z? Sure, that wasn't a need to have for right this minute. We'll put that off another year. Y'all deal more on a case-by-case basis. Yes. We don't really have a pot that people donate to for specific needs like some ministries in a church do. So we don't have that, hey, here's $1,500. Go spend it wisely. It's more we go to the church, the leadership, and say we need X, Y, and Z for the next year. So my question is, how do you handle, this will be the last thing for this, how do you handle large-scale projects?
Large-scale projects do take a while. My church has been very, very good about saving. I think I wasn't even here in 93, 94. I was still states away. But the built a new building. They had outgrown their sanctuary and had to build a new building, and they came together, and the people of the church did the labor. They built the building themselves, and they didn't have to take out a loan for it because it was paid for by them saying, "Hey, this is what we've got in the bank. This is what we're going to need. Can we, get together and make this happen?" And everybody said, "You know what? This is going to happen. This is worth it." So it became really a matter of how can we do this without breaking our bank, without having to take out a loan. And that's so important, and especially in my church, we don't take out loans for anything. But that's one of the real important things is we work with what we have. What we don't have as far as money, we make up for by having, say, somebody who knows what they're doing come in and do the work themselves rather than contract that out. And as we're building our sound, we're building a new sound system in our church and a lighting system and everything. Instead of getting somebody to come in to say, this is what you need, this is how you need to set it up, I have, two very, very capable sound techs, and I'm also a part of the sound team there. I run cameras, I run the X32 board, I run the live stream when somebody's not there, and then when everybody's not there, sometimes I have to run it all myself. But
been there.
It's really a matter of bringing the right people together to make it happen rather than just going out and cutting a check. And that's really what, as far as building sound systems, as far as building my worship team, because my worship team is still very much in the growth stage. We're relatively new. We've only even been a team for less than 2 years. So building this team is really about getting the right people together with the same goals, with the same hearts for the Lord, the right posture of the heart, and that's so important. And getting everybody on the same page, saying this is what we need. How are we going to make this happen? And that's really where the decisions come in.
That's cool. The only thing that I would add to the end of that y'all doesn't sound like y'all have had to fight as much, but as you get bigger as a church, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to deal with it. I've dealt with it multiple times. The one thing that gets left off a lot of times in a church budgeting process, especially when it comes to worship and sound systems and these types of things, is what we call capital expenditures and replacements. So without getting too technical, a lot of accountants probably heard that. And if they watch this, they're like, ooh, I know that. The replacements is the part I'm focused on real quickly. And that is stuff goes bad. Stuff dies. So if you don't ever put money into the pot, knowing that those things are going to die, you're always going to be dealing with projects. And the projector died. How do we replace it? That's the one thing that every church that I've ever been a part of or been brought in to talk to struggles with is when you buy something, you need to already be thinking about the lifespan of that. An X32 soundboard is one that we both use and we're very familiar with. While we're putting it in, I'm always thinking about, okay, what's the next 5-year plan? I need to pretend that this board is only going to last 5, 6, 7 years tops. Where do we go from there? Do I put money back to replace it, or do I just start prepping the project to roll out the next level? That kind of thing. So without getting into the deep weeds on that, I just want to make sure that as you try to budget practically, that you don't forget the replacement costs, the technology upgrades, things like that. You've got network switches, you've got Wi-Fi now that's pretty much required to do some forms of worship in a larger setup. So these things can't be neglected. You can't just go to Walmart and grab a wireless router and hope that it's going to work perfectly for your setup. It's not. I can tell you, I'm a computer guy, I'm a network guy. You have to invest in better networking, better tech. And while you're doing it, you have to think about, okay, these devices are only going to last 3 to 5 years. So I need to start prepping for the next phase, which is upgrading to Wi-Fi 6, upgrading to faster cabling, things like that. But anyway,
sometimes I think the answer is also looking back. We've been dealing with wireless microphones for, I don't know, at least since I've been there, and we've had a couple of different sets of wireless mics. Well, we're in practice, and all of a sudden we start getting this popping sound, and one of the microphones starts trying to switch channels. Well, you know what the solution was? We got rid of the wireless microphones. We went back to our old wired microphones, and you know what? I promise you, the worship sounded better with those old wired microphones.
Yeah, don't even get me started. I'm a wired fan, man. Wireless is the bane of my existence.
I understand that, but I also, being a guitar player, I like my wireless guitar.
You like freedom, I get it. That vocalists like their freedom with their handhelds. But let's be real, handhelds are expensive for good quality. Handhelds act up. Man, do they act up.
Yeah, they do.
And the government keeps sticking their hand in it and telling us we can't use these wireless microphones, and I keep having to replace them. So I fully agree, and I understand where you're coming with that.
And even as far as the budget is concerned, if it doesn't need to move, it doesn't need to be wireless.
To a point, I could make the argument that a mic can be in one static place but still be wireless for the simple fact that it's not a trip hazard. So you can go both ways with that, but in general, I agree with that statement. If it doesn't move and it doesn't need to move, why have batteries? Why have problems? So I agree.
And with every implementation of technology, you're also opening the door for more new problems.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we're not going to take up all your time today. So once again, we are budget worship. We're going to delve into these topics. Some of these, we're going to use different formats. Some of this will be long form podcasts. Some will be short form. Some will be documentary style training. Some of you are familiar with budget worship leaders. We'll be leaning on that for reviews of some equipment. We'll even do some reviews with both of us together on some of the audio visual and tech side, so that you have actual practical things that you can look at and say, oh, I like that. Let me use what they did, or let me take what they did and make it better. And please reach out, give us comments, let us know, what do you like about what we're doing? What do you dislike? We're big boys, we can handle it. But the point is, pray, keep a good heart for the Lord, make smart decisions, solve real world problems. Just because you need something doesn't mean you need the best. Fix a real problem and feel good about it and move on. But anyway, we will be trying to do roughly weekly releases on these, so join us as we bring a next episode. Let us know in the comments on YouTube and Facebook. Check out our blog on budgetworship.com, and we look forward to bringing some more content as we move forward, and hopefully bring some new faces, talk to some more people and some new points of view, and solve some different problems. Anyway,